תודה לכם.
אני שמחה לעבור לאורח השלישי. I'm very happy to introduce our third speaker. يشرفني أن أعرض على المتحدث الثالث ضيفنا من الإمارات Professor Abdallah Galadari, Assistant Professor of Islamic Studies at Khalifa University of Science and Technology. He holds a PhD in Arabic and Islamic Studies from the University of Aberdeen, Scotland, and his research focuses on Quranic hermeneutics within its late antiquity context, focusing on the intertextuality between the Quran and biblical, rabbinic, and extra-biblical literature. Abdallah, thank you for coming. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum, shalom aleichem. Thank you all very much for attending and joining this session. So let me share my screen here. Okay, so I hope everybody is able to see this. Okay, so I'll be talking about how to use the digital humanities in the service of intertextual studies between the Quran and biblical literature. And basically, the main thing that we use in intertextual studies is looking into data mining, and specifically textual mining, looking into patterns of things. Okay, so to understand the principles of intertextuality, Jeffrey Leonard basically suggested that we have to be looking for a shared language. And shared language would include basically language that is rare or distinctive. And basically, the more rare these kinds of terms used, the stronger the evidence there is of a commonality of intertextuality between two different types of texts. We also look into shared phrases, and they are even stronger. When we see shared phrases, they are stronger than just individual terms. And multiple shared language is stronger also than a single shared term or phrase. And we also look into the shared language in a similar context, rather than just in a different context, because the more similar the context is, the stronger the connection between the intertexts are. And the shared language, however, does not need to be accompanied by shared ideology or even by shared form. So they can have a different ideology because they could be repurposed. These allusions could be repurposed, re-articulated for different ideas. So looking for allusions, we look into shared language, parallel terms, parallel phraseology, parallel themes, and parallel contexts. Now, the challenges of intertextuality between biblical, rabbinic literature and the Quran is huge. And the reason mainly is because we're using different languages. We're comparing between different languages. We're comparing between different time frames, different audiences. And also within the digital humanities, we're really looking into many different databases as well at the same time, whenever we're looking for these textual patterns. There's also another challenge within the Quran itself, because in the Quran actually has many different audiences. It's not one single monolithic audience, which is somewhat also a bit different than the majority of the rabbinic literature or the biblical literature, in which the audience is usually pretty much the same. It's a single audience, for example, in which these texts are addressing. But the Quran has many different audiences. For example, it has the pre-Islamic Arabs, and even the pre-Islamic Arabs are not monolithic. They might have had many various indigenous belief systems in different parts and different localities and different Arab tribes at the time. The Quran has a Jewish audience, and most likely the evidence is pointing more and more towards rabbinic Judaism, in which the Quran was engaging with. And the Quran is also engaging with many different kinds of Christian audiences. And the Christian audiences are of many different theologies and different churches, different Christologies, such as the Ethiopic Church, the Coptic Church of Alexandria, the Syriac churches, the Byzantine Church, as well as the Arians. And also the audience of the Quran would be the new community that the Quran is forming. So the own Quranic community and the followers of that Quranic community. So those are many different challenges also within the Quran. Now, looking into some of the digital collections and databases that exist, for example, there are many different kinds of software that allows for data mining, textual mining. Some software in Arabic, for example, is Ash-Shamila. In English, there's the Logos Bible software, which is not only in English, but it's also in many other biblical literature, which includes, therefore, Hebrew and Aramaic and Greek. And there are many also available online lexicons, such as the Doha Historical Dictionary of Arabic, the Comprehensive Aramaic Lexicon Project by the Hebrew Union College. And there are many digitized manuscripts as well, like the ones in the National Library of Israel, the Qatar Digital Library, the Princeton University Library, and so forth. So what I will be giving you is a case study and looking into how we use those many different kinds of databases and doing textual mining in searching for a kind of intertextuality. So I'll be discussing a case study, and that case study is a passage in the Quran, which is in Quran chapter 3, verse 93. And it says that all at-ta'am, and in here I did not want to basically translate at-ta'am because it's usually translated as food, but I don't want to translate as at-ta'am. And the reason is because you will see that perhaps at-ta'am actually could mean something even different than simply food. But in this passage, it says, all at-ta'am was lawful unto the children of Israel, except what Israel had forbidden for himself before the Torah was sent down. Say, bring the Torah and recite it if you are truthful. So we'll look into this case study and see what is the context, because what is interesting is that nothing in the verses prior to this passage and nothing in the verses after this passage has anything to do with food. And so having this at-ta'am in here seems to be a little bit out of context. And that is why it was an interesting thing to search for, looking into any kinds of intertextualities that we may try to identify which the Quran might be engaging with. So first, starting to search for allusions. And one of the things in searching for allusions is looking into similar language and looking into parallel terms. And one of those parallel terms could be the word at-ta'am. What is the word ta'am? Well, looking into the root senses of this ta'am, so looking into the textual mining of how the Hebrew Bible uses this term, then we find that this root has many various meanings. Obviously, it could mean taste or food, but it also means other things, especially like an edict, a command, understanding, and so forth, especially when looking into Aramaic. So when we do a little bit of the textual mining, when we search for the Hebrew Bible, if we look into the Hebrew root, then we do see, as you could see in the left image, that the Hebrew root is mostly used for food or taste. But when we search for the Aramaic root instead, such as what we would see in the books of Ezra and Daniel, we will see that the meaning mostly used for the word ta'am is actually the meaning of edict or decree instead of food or taste. Well, now then let's look into the Arabic databases and see what do the Arabic databases tell us about the root ta'am, and does it have other meanings besides just meaning of food or taste? And we do find that in the Arabic language, it is, although very rarely, but it has another meaning, which is the meaning of aql or understanding. So to have an understanding. So the root is used for that. And therefore, we could see that basically there is perhaps a possibility in the comparison between the Aramaic usage of understanding for the word ta'am, as well as the Arabic understanding, though rarely used. So what we do is basically look into what is some of the earliest attestations of the meaning of the word ta'am in the Arabic language. And so for that, for example, we search for the early uses in Arabic literature, and the Doha Historical Dictionary of Arabic gives us a very good database, which looks into the first attestations of any kind of roots and their senses, their meanings. And it also, this database, the Doha Historical Dictionary, has a huge database which also looks into epigraphies and not only just manuscripts. So it also looks into epigraphies, those that are engraved in stone, for example. And we identify that one of the roots used in the early manuscripts, in the early Arabic manuscripts, is that the word ta'ama can also be understood as a trait or a conduct. And we can see that the earliest usage for that is about in the early 8th century. So that we're basically now talking about 100 years after the Quran. And this understanding or this sense of the term ta'am can be seen obviously in the Aramaic, the meaning of trait, the meaning of conduct. So we can see that it is also attested in the Arabic language. So it's not only attested in Aramaic, but it is also attested in the Arabic language, at least in the early 8th century. So is there also some kind of evidence of wordplay using this root, ta'am? And we do see that there are basically some midrash, for example, and this is one example, and there are many examples from rabbinic literature that shows the wordplay of how many of the rabbis and early authors of the midrashim, they also use the wordplay using the root ta'am for both the meaning of understanding as well as the meaning of taste or food. Okay, so now that we understand that we have this word ta'am, which can have a sense that might be similar to that we find in the Aramaic roots of the Hebrew Bible. The question is, let's look into the context, because when we're looking for intertextualities, we're not just looking for terms, but we're looking for context, we're looking for themes, we're looking for phrases. So let's try to understand what the context is that the passage of that Quran has. And we see that the context that the Quran passage has, basically in the verses immediately after, it discusses about the first house. أول بيت. So it says basically, truly the first house established for humankind was that at Becca, full of blessing and guidance for the worlds. Therein are clear signs, the station or maqam of Abraham, and whosoever enters it shall be secure. And pilgrimage or hajj is to the house is a duty upon humankind before God for those who can find a way. For whoever disbelieves, truly God is beyond need of the world. So this is apparently what the context is. So when we're searching for allusions, the initial passage is talking about ta'am, and it's talking about bringing the Torah and reciting the Torah. And immediately within that context, so the passages later, it's talking about the house of God, the building of the house of God, the temple of God, in other words, and it's talking about pilgrimage. So here we can see that the context bears some kind of similarities with the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. Because in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, we basically see the public recitation of the Torah, we see the rebuilding of the second temple, and we see the exiles of the Israelites returning back to Jerusalem as pilgrims. So here we see that perhaps we might find some kind of context. So in Ezra and Nehemiah, the Israelites who return back to Jerusalem, they do celebrate different kinds of Hajj or Hajj. They celebrate the Festival of Booths, for example. They also, the Hajj HaSukkot, they celebrate Pesach after the dedication of the temple, after rebuilding the temple. So we can see here that perhaps there is some kind of contextual resemblance with the passage in the Quran. Another thing that we also see is that in the book of Haggai, it also has some kind of resemblance in terms of the terms that are used, as well as the context. So the context, again, is about the rebuilding of the second temple. And it basically, in Haggai, for example, it says that the second temple, so the Habayit Hazah, Acharon, so this latter bait is more splendorous in this maqam, in this place, than the first bait, the Habayit Rishon. So the first bait. So basically, it also says that, and basically, the bait is given peace. So it's a place of peace, a place, shalom, a place of security. So when we compare some of those terms used in that passage in the Quran, we see that it's talking about the first bait, Habayit HaRishon, in other words. It's talking about the maqam, again, which is similar to the maqam. And of course, the rabbinic literature is filled using the word maqam for the Temple Mount as well. And it is the maqam of Abraham, because in the rabbinic literature, we also see that it is the maqam of Abraham. The Temple Mount is the place, is the maqam where basically Abraham wanted to sacrifice his son. And in the passage in the Quran, it also says that whoever enters it shall be secure, shall be safe, similar to how it is also used in the phraseology we see in Haggai. And of course, that's beyond, of course, the word Hajj and the name Haggai, of course, has some kind of similarities, but this may be simply just coincidence, perhaps. But in any case, we do see some kind of similarities between those terms. And when we're looking for those similarities, so here we can see the first house, Habeit HaRishon, for example, the Maqam al-Maqam, and the Shalom, the peace for anyone who enters this place. Another thing is looking into the term Maqam Ibrahim. So what is Maqam Ibrahim? Well, basically, in the rabbinic literature, we understand that the maqam is the place of the binding of Isaac, where Abraham wanted to sacrifice his son, and the place is called Mount Moriah, according to the book of Genesis, and the Temple Mount. And looking into these patterns, basically, when we're doing this textual mining, we are searching for the word maqam, and we are searching for the person of Abraham. So where does the word maqam and Abraham occur in the Hebrew Bible almost together, as it is in the Quranic passage, for example? And we can see that the vast majority of that is in Genesis 22, where it is talking about the binding of Isaac. Well, another thing to look into this context also is the word Becca. Well, what is the word Becca? Now, for example, many of the Muslim commentators, the early Muslim commentators, have suggested that the word Becca might be simply just another name for Mecca. And by the way, something to also keep in mind, that the temple, according to in Judaism, in Jerusalem, has certain terminologies which has parallels themselves with some of the terms of the Kaaba in Mecca, so the Great Mosque of Mecca. For example, the Great Mosque of Mecca has next to it a mount called Mount Marwa, which itself is similar to in name as Mount Moriah. Also, according to rabbinic literature, for example, after the destruction of the temple by the Romans, then anybody, according to some of the rabbinic literature, anyone who would come to visit Jerusalem, they would first go to Har Sophim, Mount Scopus, Har Sophim, and from Har Sophim, they would direct themselves to the Temple Mount, to Mount Moriah, and to weep for the destruction of the temple. And the Har Sophim, or the Sophim itself, there is also, it has itself a similar term to a mountain in Mecca next to the Grand Mosque of Mecca as well, which is a Mount of Safa. So we can see Safa and Marwa, Sophim and Moriah. So we basically, so there are so many parallel terms that had been used within the context as well of the Grand Mosque of Mecca. So anyways, Becca basically understood as another term for Mecca, according to many of the early Muslim commentators. But of course, the root term Becca coming from Becca, which means to weep. And we can see also, when we're doing some textual mining, looking into patterns, we can also basically look into where does the Habeit HaRishon, sorry. So Habeit HaRishon is within the context of the root Baka. And we can see that it also is found in the book of Ezra, discussing the first house. And basically it says that when the Israelites who returned back to Jerusalem and who were there during the first house, the first temple, and they saw Jerusalem and the rebuilding of the second temple, they wept. So they wept basically for that. Another term also interesting to know within the context of the passage within the Quran. The passage within the Quran, for example, talks about the context of people who repent and people who make amendments or who tries to prosper the land, to make better the land, using the term salah. Again, we can see the root salah in the Hebrew Bible also used in the book of Ezra, talking about, of course, the people who repented and people who seek for the prosperity of the land. So we can see here that there's many things, many parallels within the context. Also, more on the context as well is looking into the public recitation. So the public recitation of the Torah, we can see in the book of Nehemiah, for example, where Ezra basically brings in the Torah, brings in the Torah of Moses, the commands of God, the laws of God, and recites them in public. And basically, when the people also listened to this recitation, they did weep. So again, the term baka comes in here. And also another thing that is very interesting when we're doing these textual mining and looking into patterns is that when the Torah was recited, and it wasn't just only recited, but it was also given the understanding or the meanings for it. So miforash visom sekel. So visom sekel itself, which means to give the meaning or to give the understanding, we can see that itself is used in a different way within the book of Ezra, which is basically sim ta'am. So sim ta'am also means, is a different way, a different phrase, which also means som sekel, which is basically to give understanding or to give the meaning of what was being recited, of the decrees that are being recited. So here we see this again, this loop with the term ta'am again. Other further evidence of perhaps of parallel language. Well, when we continue with the passage in the Quran within the same context, we see that the Quran, for example, uses certain terms which are very interesting for our case. For example, it says, and hold fast to the rope of God, and the word rope is habl, all together and be not divided. Remember the blessing, ni'mah of God upon you when you were enemies and he joined your hearts such that you became brothers, ikhwana, by his blessing, bi ni'matihi. And later on also within the same context, it says that they shall be struck with abasement wherever they are come upon, except by means of a rope, habl from God, and a rope or habl from people. So here we basically see that there is this kind of rope. So, or in other words, this kind of covenant language, in other words, between God and the people and between the people themselves. So if we look into the word habl, habl of course meaning also the line, rope in Hebrew as well. And we do see when we're looking for parallel patterns, then we do see that the word habl and the other terms such as ni'mah and the term ikhwana, for example, all of these also join into one interesting kind of pattern in the book of Zechariah. So here we can see, for example, the word habl with hublim and or huvlim, and we also see the word ni'mah with nu'am, and we see the word ikhwana with ha'achava. And basically in the book of Zechariah, the context there is basically discussing about the covenant between the both kingdoms, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, and how those covenant between those two kingdoms was destroyed together, but still God would be able to bring them together again. So basically when we're searching for allusions, we see shared language. Parallel terms here, we're seeing the terms ta'am, maqam or maqam, the root habl, na'am, ikhwan or akhava, Salah and Baka. We also see parallel phraseology such as Habayt Harishon or Awwal Bayt. We also see parallel themes, Maqam of Abraham, and talking about, and it's a place of safety and security, the theme of repentance, the theme of covenant, and we also see parallel context, which is bringing the Torah and reciting it, building the house or the temple of God, as well as pilgrimage. So we basically see, when we're searching for allusions, again, we're looking for all of these things. We're looking for parallel terms, parallel phraseology, parallel themes, and parallel context. And when we see them all together, and they're all pointing to one thing, then we can understand perhaps that there is a strong evidence of intertextuality between those things. And it is only perhaps possible once we have these kinds of textual mining that we're doing with different databases.
Abdallah, perhaps you want to conclude this fascinating presentation?
Yes, so to conclude, so looking into now back to the case study, the original passage, all at-ta'am was lawful unto the children of Israel, except what Israel had forbidden for himself before the Torah. So perhaps here, at-ta'am actually means decrees and commandments instead of food, because then it will work much better with the passages and the verses before and after this Quranic passage, which has nothing to do with with food itself, and it becomes in a better circle with the intertextuality with the Quran as well. I mean, with the biblical literature as well. So is the Quran stitching together different biblical references, or is there a midrash or a darashot that the Quran is using as a subtext or an oral tradition? Well, it's very difficult to know, but of course, as we discover more historical manuscripts, and as important as discovering them is to digitize them, then it will be much easier also to look into these textual things. Of course, we need to try to beat some of the challenges because we're comparing different languages, Hebrew, Aramaic versus Arabic cognates of terms, and we have to search for different multiple databases. So the digital humanities, of course, opens doors to look into connections that are not always obvious. They do not always preserve a known heritage, but they also assist us in finding long lost heritage that we haven't that has not been basically transferred to later generations. So thank you all very much. Toda rabba, shukran jazilan.
Thank you very much, Professor Galadari. I'll take the privilege of the chairperson of this panel to ask you, you showed us very conclusive evidence how the texts speak with each other. Perhaps you have ideas how you could take this further to discuss how the readers of this text perhaps spoke with each other.
Yes, thank you very much for this question. And of course, trying to understand the audience that the Quran is discussing with, who is the audience that the Quran is discussing with, and what is the Quran in discussion with. So this is actually part of a much bigger project that I'm working with. And basically in the bigger project, I try to show that the passages that the Quran is discussing with in here is basically engaging with Jewish liturgy, looking into the daily Shema and the daily Amidah, which talks about, of course, the returning of the exiles of the, and it's not talking just generally speaking from the historical perspective, but even into the future. So the return of the exiles from the four corners of the earth and so forth. So, so basically we, looking into the bigger picture, the audience would be a Jewish audience who do have an understanding of the daily Shema prayer and the daily Amidah.
Okay, thank you very much. And if there perhaps a quick question, or you could write in the chat room for Professor Galadari. If there is none, and considering there is a very hectic program ahead of us, I want to conclude this panel. Toda Rabba. Thank you, everyone.